My story is a long one, but I hope that listeners will find some value in it to apply to their own stories. When I was in high school, I was very much into all the extracurriculars. I went the conventional route for a while, doing your standard school clubs, newspaper, things of that nature. And by senior year, I was able to rise to leadership positions in those activities. But what I really ended up wanting to highlight in my own personal application was something that was a bit different, that went beyond the school environment. Just through a series of coincidences, or maybe not, I ended up going to a United Nations conference in South Africa the summer before my senior year of high school. My recommendation letters were written by diplomats. So I kind of ended up crafting my entire application around that experience. All the other stuff, everything I'd worked so hard for within the school environment up to that point, it kind of all went out the window when I was able to highlight this instead. And so that ended up being the reason I ultimately got into Columbia. I spoke with, the person who reviewed my application, and she said that was obviously what clearly stood out to her. So after I gained acceptance, I started helping out friends, kids in my high school the year below me. Yeah. And I ended up offering services around New York City, where I was at Columbia, to essay help and application advice. And so upon graduating, that was the clear next step for me, simply to continue that. And so I founded the Get Into College blog back when I graduated, which was over 10 years ago now. And then I also founded Reddit's College Admissions Forum a few years later. But I ended up discovering podcasts and loving that medium. And so that's where the College Admissions Toolbox podcast came from, just kind of a further outgrowth of those experiences. My time at Columbia was a blast. I loved it. It was everything I wanted it to be and more. But I think at first I was so excited about the socializing and the extracurriculars that I didn't necessarily focus enough on the academic side of things. And so once I made academics my focus, it's a funny thing. I ended up taking more classes than average. I think I took 21 credits or 6 or 7 classes one semester. It's kind of funny. I feel like the work of Cal Newport always ends up coming back to me. For those who don't know, Cal Newport is a best-selling author. He's a computer science professor in the DC area. I believe it may be at Georgetown, if I remember correctly. But he ended up writing a book called Deep Work about focusing on one thing at a time to the exclusion of others, blocking out time in your schedule. And so that principle ended up helping me out a lot in college, even though he hadn't yet written his book. The other funny thing about his work is that he wrote a book called How to Be a High School Superstar. He featured me in that book, my example of going to this United Nations conference. And he categorized what I had done as something called the failed simulation effect, meaning that other people looking at it from the outside won't even necessarily be able to understand how you got to that place where you ended up. And so it sounds more impressive just the same. And so for me, having lived the experience, it doesn't maybe feel quite as impressive, even though I know it sounds that way to others. And so, but ultimately, I think that what drove me was just curiosity and wanting to go bigger than my previous environment allowed. Because in the school environment, there's going to be a newspaper, there's going to be a track team, there's going to be other extracurriculars and clubs and student body president, but every high school has one of those. And so you're competing with all the other fish in that pond, so to speak. Whereas if you go outside the school environment to the real world, you'll likely be the only high school student there. And so my specific path was, I was a sophomore in high school. I was really interested in politics. And so I emailed every single nonprofit I could find. I just went on their websites, found the contact info, just sent a simple cover letter to every single one. And of course, being a high school kid, sending this unsolicited, most of them got ignored. But I emailed over 100 or 200 different nonprofits. If you're a parent who wants your kid to do something like this, you can't force it. You can't force your kid to go on 100 or 200 different websites and send a good cover letter to every single one of them that's personalized and tailor-made. It's not going to happen. It has to be from the student's own passion. And so I wanted this, I did it. And it's kind of funny, of course, most said no. I think I got like 1 or 2 yeses. And then one of the yeses, they hadn't known I was a high school kid. They hadn't read carefully. And so once they discovered that, they kind of shut the door on me. But there was this one organization that was called Physicians for Human Rights. And they didn't have an internship opening for me, but maybe they didn't want to manage a high school kid. That's fine. But they did have an upcoming UN conference that was specifically focused on children's issues. And they said that they had the unique opportunity to bring along a child delegate as part of their group. I was like, absolutely, sign me up. And because I happened to be living in the New York suburbs, it was fairly easy for me to go to that. But if not, I would have wanted to find a way to travel there. So I did that, and that was a blast. And then, I go back to ordinary life as a high school kid, but through some inter-school model Congress convention, I ended up mentioning in passing to someone that was going to this UN conference coming up. And she said, "Oh, I work with this other nonprofit that does UN stuff. Do you want to be part of that?" And it was mostly comprised of college students. And she and I were the only high school folks at the time. But I saw this opportunity and there was that UN connection. And so I went for it. And the next thing you know, I'm fundraising to go to South Africa. I guess there's a bit of serendipity there, but it's also about seeking things out and mentioning them wherever possible, I suppose.